Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In episode 26, I showed you how to create a new Blazor Server application with basic identity features for authentication and authorization. In this episode, I'll show you how to add identity to an existing Blazor Server app. Next week, I'll show you how to add identity services to a Blazor WebAssembly application, which is a bit different. Adding identity. It's what's for dinner. Oh yeah. Right now, right here on
Blazor Train.
So I'm starting with this GitHub repo that I've created for this particular episode. It's at github.com/carlfranklin/add identity server. Now that's not identity server, the product. That's adding identity to Blazor Server. That's why I called it this, okay? So we're going to use Microsoft ASP.NET identity, and we're going to add that to an existing Blazor Server project with .NET 7 that we're going to create. But think of it as if the application already exists. First, a couple definitions. Authentication is the process of confirming that a user is the person they say they are, and that user is represented by an identity. Authorization is different. Now that we know the user's identity, what are we going to allow them to do? Authorization is allowing the user to access aspects of your application based on their identity and the roles or claims they present. A role is simply a name. Admin, supervisor, or content manager. You can assign users to one or more roles, and then check those roles at runtime to authorize the user to do or see an aspect of the application. We're going to use roles in this episode. A claim is a little bit different. It's an assertion by the user, such as their name or email address. It can also be very specific to an aspect of the application, such as can click the counter button. A claim is like a role, but a little bit different, and claims are being favored over roles, but role-based authentication is still very useful and very powerful. So we're going to be using the ASP.NET Core identity subsystem, including support for roles. Now, the default Blazor Server template does not include support for identity, but in episode 26, I showed you how to create a greenfield Blazor Server application with identity baked in. We're assuming that you have an existing Blazor Server app and that you want to add authorization and authentication to it. When we're done, our Blazor Server app will allow users to register, log in, and log out. We can then authorize sections of markup. We can authorize entire pages and even code based on whether or not the user is authenticated and what roles they are in. So I'm going to create a new Blazor Server app called Basic Auth. .NET 7, I am not going to select an authentication type. All right, we're assuming that you're starting with a Blazor Server application that does not have authentication built in. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is double click on the csproj file and add a couple of packages. I added Microsoft Visual Studio.web.codegeneration.design and Microsoft ASP.NET Core.diagnostics.entityFramework Core. So the Microsoft Visual Studio Web Code Generation Design package allows us to use scaffolding. The second package here contains types related to capturing and reporting diagnostics for Entity Framework Core in ASP.NET Core. So let's talk about scaffolding. Visual Studio has a great scaffolding wizard for adding ASP.NET Core identity features. But as of this video, mid-July 2023, the generated code has not caught up to what's in the template. But we're going to start with the scaffolding and fix what we need to along the way. So right-click on the project and select Add New Scaffolded Item. Now you're going to go down on the left to Identity and select Identity, which is the only one you can select in the list, and Add. Now you might get this error right here. There was an error running the selected code generator. Install the package, Microsoft Visual Studio Web Code Generation Design, and try again. Well, that's a bug. It has been a bug before, and that's why we built the project. But still, there's an issue here. I'm just going to add it again. Okay, so now we get this amazing array of features that we can add. I'm going to select account login, account logout, and account register. But look, there's so many other things that you can do. Log in with two-factor authentication, confirm email change. There's a lot with email. You have to set up an email server for that. But I'm just going to stick to these three. Then you have to click this plus button here for the DB context class. And it's going to suggest a name. The name of the project, .data, name of the project with a context appended to it. Now you can click Add. Now what's going to happen is we're going to do a couple of commands at the Package Manager console to create a migration that will generate the auth database, which is a standard schema for ASP.NET Core identity, and then another one to actually create the database. But what happened when we just did this is if you go into app settings JSON, this connection string was added, and it's the name of the project, basic auth, with context connection. And it's basically told us that it's going to name the database the same name as our project, which is a little bit different from when you create an app with the basic individual accounts template. Again, subtle differences in what's happening here. But if you go to the SQL Server Object Explorer and expand SQL Server, local DB, and databases, you should not see any database called basic auth. And some alert viewer said, hey, the name basic auth might be misleading because that has a specific meaning in terms of the type of authentication protocols that it uses. That I just picked basic auth because that's what it is. It's a very simple ASP.NET Core identity based auth that comes with the template and that we can do and we can add to an existing app. All right, so how do we make this happen? You go to the Package Manager console and you're going to say add-migration space create identity schema. Now watch what happens over here. Now we have a migrations folder and we have the create identity schema class, which is all of the code to create the database. Yes. And then there's also the basic auth context model snapshot right there, which is just more plumbing code needed to handle the database. So next we go to Package Manager console and we type update-database. This will create the database. Done. Now if we go here and refresh databases, there it is right there, basic auth. And if you expand the tables, you can see we've got ASP.NET users, we've got ASP.NET roles, and ASP.NET user roles. Those are the ones that we're going to be focused on here. Next, we're going to open app.razor. So check this out. This is the standard app.razor that you get with a Blazor Server app, and it's got a route view. So let's change this. Okay, now we've wrapped the entire thing in a cascading authentication state, meaning we can create a cascading parameter to get the instance of that authentication state in any component. Also, the route view has been turned into an authorized route view. If you don't do this, authentication ain't going to work. Now I'm going to go to the areas identity folder and I'm going to add a new class. You can grab this right from the repo. It's called Revalidating Identity Authentication State Provider. So this class inherits revalidating server authentication state provider, which is a base class for authentication state provider services that receive an authentication state from the host environment and revalidate it at regular intervals. This file would get added if we selected individual accounts as the authentication type when creating the project in Visual Studio. Next, I'm going to go to Program CS, and I'm going to replace it with some new stuff here. So to this call to add default identity, we added add roles, identity role. We added our authentication state provider with that revalidating identity authentication state provider of identity user. We added app.use authorization, and we added app.map controllers. Now we're going to go to the shared folder and add a new Razor component called login display. And this is what gets shown in the top bar where it says, if you're authorized, hello, user identity name, and has a link to log out. If you're not authorized, it has a link to register and a link to log in. And now we need to modify main layout and put that guy right here in the top bar. So if we run the app now and we register and we log in and try to log out, logging out won't work. We need to make a change. We're going to go to Areas, Identity, Pages, Account, and change Logout CSHTML. And this is what I'm going to change it to. And this is the same logout that we used in episode 26. All right, now before we run this, I'm going to do some authorization of markup in nav menu. So what I've done here in the nav menu is for the counter page, I've wrapped it in an authorized view. Now that means the user has to be logged in, registered and logged in before they can see this nav link going to counter. And for fetch data, check this out. So in this case, the authorized view says the user not only has to be registered and logged in, but they also have to be in the admin role, which is just a name, remember, in order to see this nav link to fetch data. So let's just run this to make sure that these authorizing features are working. And they are. Now I can register, but before I register, I want to make note of this. I can still navigate to counter. There it is. Or fetch data just by changing the URL in the address bar. So all we've done is we've done some authorization around these nav links. Let's go ahead and register. We'll click register. And I'm going to create a new account. Of course, you should be using a password manager in the real world, right? Now, here's the thing. You're going to get this register confirmation. And typically, you would have an email server set up. It would send an email to the user. They would click that. And then what would happen is a field would be set in the database on their account. Let me show you. If we go to the ASP.NET users table and view the data, you see this email confirmed field, and it's false. Once I click here to confirm the account, which just shortcuts the whole email thing, if I go back and refresh this table, now email confirmed is true. So if email confirmed is not true, you can't log in. But now it's true, so I can log in. Okay, good. The counter shows up here, right? Because I have to be logged in order to see that link. Okay. Fetch data doesn't show up here because I'm not in an admin role yet. However, I can still type fetch data in the address bar and I can still get there. All right, now let's button up counter and fetch data, the actual pages. I'm going to go to the counter page, which is under pages, and I'm going to add this attribute, authorize, at line 2. And what that says is this entire page cannot be viewed unless the user is logged in. Now, what about fetch data? Well, let's go there. Fetch data requires us to be in the admin role, so I'm going to add that right here. Attribute authorize, parens, roles equals admin, and this is just a comma-separated list of roles. Now this says, not only does the user have to be logged in order to see this page, but they also have to be in the admin role. So now let's try it again. Okay, I'm going to log out. I don't see counter. I don't see fetch data. Let's try to go to them directly. Not authorized. And fetch data, also not authorized. Okay, now I'll log in. Now I see counter. And what happens when I try to navigate to fetch data? Not authorized, because I'm not in the admin role. All right, so how do we manage the roles? Well, I mean, if you really want, you can go into the database and just start mucking around. But I have an easier solution. So this is another repo that I've created, GitHub Carl Franklin Identity Manager Library. And what this is a .NET Standard class library based on this GitHub repo by M. Guinness that was shown in Basic Authentication, Authorization in Blazor Server, episode 26 and episode 27. And this is the link to it. Now you can use this library in, say, a console app to create roles and apply them to users, right? Or manage it, right? Remove the role from a user record. But I've created a Blazor Server app that uses the library, and I'm going to download that as a zip file, open it up, and run it. And here it is. Now, the requirement is Identity Manager Blazor Server has to be the startup project. And if you look into app settings JSON, the database has to be the same connection string that our app is using. Doesn't matter where it is, but it has to be the same one. Because Identity Manager Library, which does the heavy lifting, is going to be working with that auth database. So let's just run it. And here we go. If I look at users, here's my user at myplace.com. There's no role specified. But if I go to roles, I can create a new role, admin, and save it. Now I can go back to users, edit my user, and select the admin role and select save. And now my user is in the admin role. So let's run our basic auth app again. You always have to log out and log back in if you've changed a role or something like that. Okay, now I've got the counter. And I see fetch data here, which has authorized me based on the fact that I'm in the admin role. And the page itself allows me to see it for the same reason. Now, this is all great for authorizing markup, but what about code? What if I wanted to check the user's role when I click this button and only allow them to click the button if they're in a particular role? That's code. That is authorizing code, not markup. Let me show you how to do that. So remember AppRaiser, this cascading authentication state that allows us to create a cascading parameter in any page or any component and access the user. What it actually gives us access to is the claims principal that identifies the user. And we can determine if they're logged in, if they're authenticated, and we can check to see if they're in a particular role. So let's go to counter, and I'm going to replace this whole page. All right, I still have my authorize attribute up here, but I added this error message down here. It's just a string, and all the markup is the same. But now I've got this cascading parameter, this task of authentication state, which is nullable, right? And that basically gives me access to the auth state. I've also defined this claims principal, which I've named user. Now, if you go down to uninitialized async, here I'm checking to see if that parameter is not null. And then I'm awaiting the task to get the authentication state back in a variable. And then I look at auth state user to get my claims principal. Now, to actually do the authorization, that happens in increment count. I'm going to set my error message to an empty string, and I'm going to check that the user is not null. This should never happen because viewing the page requires you to be logged in. Also, user identity is authenticated. Should also always be true because if you're here, you've gotten past that first rule that says you have to be logged in. I just wanted to show you how to check to see if the user is authenticated. And then this is where the magic happens. If user is in role, and the role I've picked is counter clicker, and we're going to have to add that. But if that is the case, then we're going to allow them to increment the counter. Otherwise, we're going to say you do not have permission to increment the counter. Okay, let's run it, see what happens without being in this counter clicker role. If I go to counter, click me, you do not have permission to increment the counter. Okay, it's not about the counter. It's about code, right? It's about anything that you want to authorize the user to be able to do that requires code. So let's go back to our other app, the Identity Manager Blazor Server, and we're going to create a new role called Counter Clicker. And we're going to go to Users, edit the user, and add them to the Counter Clicker role. Now we can run our app again, log out, log back in. So I go to counter. Now I'm in that role, so I'm allowed to click. So to summarize, in this module, we created a new Blazor Server project without any authentication. We added support for identity roles in Program CS. We generated the migration to create the database with the add migration command. We actually generated the database with the update-database command. We added support code and markup for server-based authentication and authorization. We ran the app and registered a new user. We authorized markup in nav menu Razor. We authorized the counter and fetch data Razor pages. We used the Identity Manager Blazor Server app to add roles and assign them. And we authorized access to code using a claims principal object that represents the user. And that's my demo. Now back to you in the studio, Carl. Oh, sorry. You caught me listening to some tunes. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time.
Blaze a train.